Hey folks, welcome to the first episode of Tinfoil News. So prepare to get your tinfoil hats on because some of this stuff in the world today is a little bit crazy. So what I thought we'd do is we'd start with we'll focus on like world politics, that kind of thing, and I'll give you an overview of what's going on right now. Now, obviously, there are some major stories going on, particularly in Ukraine, particularly in the Middle East, and some of the other weirder ones are a little bit further afield as well. So, really wanted to make sure that you get a good overview of what's going on, why it's happening, and then we can delve in a little bit deeper as well and see where we get to from there. So, the first topic that I really wanted to cover was Ukraine, which is a very emotional subject for very many people. And here in the West, particularly in Britain, which is where I reside, we are subjected to like an enormous amount of propaganda regarding the war. Mainly Russia bad, uh, and the West is good, and the Britain is good, and Ukraine Zelensky is a perfect model. He's almost been beatified or sanctified, whatever the right term is for that. So he's almost reached sainthood as far as he's concerned. And that's not to say that the Ukrainians that are fighting and the Russians that are fighting, it's that one is better than the other. I think where we are with this particular conflict is in a state of what's the best way to describe it? We're getting to a point now where it's becoming very obvious that Russia is going to win. At the same time, you have the likes of Starmer and Macron and Merz to an extent as well in Germany, saying things like Ukraine must always be supported. The territory of Ukraine is paramount, and all of these things are well and good. And in normal times, this is exactly what you'd be looking to do. So, with that said, where are we in this particular conflict? How did we get here? And there's a couple of things that we need to discuss to get to the point where we can actually talk about what's happening today. But first, we need to go back a little bit further back into time. Actually, we need to go back to essentially the end of the USSR because that's really where this story starts. So the USSR crumbled into dust. It was beaten economically, and capitalism triumphed. And this was like during the late 80s into the 90s, and the Berlin Wall falls, and essentially the USSR just disintegrates into itself. It can't keep up with what the West is doing at that point. So commercially, it's just been ground into dust. And at that point, you then have Russia then becomes a country, and you have countries like Belarus and Ukraine and Kazakhstan, all of these types of countries uh, become independent, essentially of themselves. And one of the things that has started to lead to this conflict, and one of the tropes you find rolled out from time to time, is about Ukrainian nuclear weapons and how they gave them up in the Budapest Treaty. I think it was 1994, if I remember rightly. Now, at that time, I was relatively young, didn't really care about politics too much, so this kind of really just kind of happened in the background. I was much more interested in playing football and going to pubs and things like that. Over time, my interest in world affairs and politics is hugely increased. Um, and it's fair to say that I've done a lot of reading and a lot of studying of various different documents that happened during the 90s, which is when I kind of grew up, to be honest, and what was going on at that time. And one of them was this agreement, this Budapest agreement for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. And I think this is one of these key things that's actually mistaken. They were never Ukraine's weapons. They were nuclear weapons. They were based on Ukrainian soil, but they were never operable by the Ukrainian government of the day. You actually needed certain technology, which the Russians always retained to themselves, um, to actually operate the missiles themselves. So you're in a situation whereby, like, think of it like this. So say Scotland became independent of the UK. There are various nuclear weapons that are stored in Coolport in Scotland. Would those nuclear weapons be Scottish? Well, by territory, kind of, but would Scotland be able to fire those nukes? And the answer is no, because the UK government would retain, or Westminster would retain, the way of actually installing them onto rockets and making sure that they could be fired. So it's roughly the same thing. And this is exactly what happened in 1994. Ukraine didn't give up its nuclear weapons; it just had nuclear weapons on its territory when the USSR dissolved or disintegrated, essentially. And so, America and the rest of the world were very keen to make sure that the nuclear weapons that were based on places like Belarus and Kazakhstan and Ukraine, and they were a lot based there. This was the USSR's way of bulwark, if you like, of defending against Western encroachment. Certainly, that's what was said at the time, and probably is still said to, in some way, shape, or form today. So you end up with this situation in 1994, or the early 90s, I should say, where you've got a lot of nuclear weapons which are suddenly not under Russia's complete control, but they have the ability to fire them if they need to, but they're based on foreign soil now. So how are they repatriated? And that's what the Budapest Memorandum was about. It was about repatriating those nuclear missiles to back to Russia to be fully decommissioned with the oversight of various international bodies. America signed up to this, Ukraine signed up to this, and Russia signed up to this. And that's all well and good. There's also another part to that agreement whereby the Ukrainians say that this agreement was done in such a way that Russia couldn't, sorry, Ukraine's territorial integrity would be guaranteed by both Russia and America, which is true. It was. But that territorial integrity was also true that Ukraine had to retain its neutral status. And this was implicit in the agreement. It was implicit in, and you have to remember at this point, we're kind of in the early 90s. So NATO is still basically West Germany. It hasn't really kind of gone towards Poland or Romania or and the Baltic states. So it hasn't really moved towards Russia at this point. What you've got is you've got Russia, you've got NATO, and you've got a buffer zone in between. Um, and Ukraine's one part of that, essentially that part of that buffer zone. Now, inherent in the Budapest Agreement, if you like, was the inherent neutral status of Ukraine. It wasn't deemed by both the Russians and the Americans that they would become NATO members. That was one of these things. And in fact, I think there's a lot of discussion, and there's a lot of is this right and is this wrong about uh, comments that were made by Western leaders to Russia shortly after the dissolution of the USSR that NATO wouldn't encroach, wouldn't move 1 inch westward. I think that was the quote, and that was made direct to Gorbachev. Interestingly, there was a recent thing on TV where a lot of Western commentators said that was never said. That was never said in the room. And then actually Gorbachev and a bunch of people came out and said, I was there. Was actually said. That was said to us. And then you guys did it. Am I blaming NATO for moving westwards? No, because of course they were going to. That's kind of a given, basically. If they saw that Russia was weak, they saw they could get their missiles and everything, and it protects Western civilization. That's how NATO see it. The closer we get to Russia, the better the chance we've got of stopping them. If they ever decide to try and roll into Northern Europe, which was never really going to happen. But that's the military industrial complex needs to fund itself somehow. So let's scare the population. Let's make sure that the funding keeps happening. And that's where we are today a little bit. We're in this place where the population is being scared into Putin's a terrible person. I'm not saying he's great. I don't think he's the next Hitler, for instance. Um, and whether this, am I allowed to say Hitler on YouTube? I have no idea. That might get censored out. We'll see. So that's where we are. We're in a position right now where the Western media is basically saying how terrible a person Putin is, and we're all saints. I doubt that that's the case. In fact, I know that's not the case. So where we are in Ukraine is that we've had a war that's been brewing ever since that Budapest Memorandum. Why has it been building since the Budapest Memorandum? Because of the inherent neutrality that was built into the wording in that document. It Ukraine was supposed to stay neutral. That was a given. It was such a given that it wasn't really even talked about. It wasn't even actually penned in that Ukraine must retain its neutral status because that was just expected. Then what happens is you get 2 years down the line, like 97, or 3 years down the line, something like that. You get to 1997, and you get this what's it, partnership for peace, or something like that, or path to peace, or something like that, from NATO. And what they start doing is because Russia's weak at this point, they're on their arse. Let's be honest. NATO knew that it could move. It could move its borders. That they could take in more people. And why would NATO be more interested in taking in more countries? Well, there's two ways you can look at it, I suppose. One's the kind of, well, we're moving our weaponry closer to Russia. That stops them. Or the other way, which is slightly more cynical, which is that when you join NATO, guess what? You have to buy NATO weaponry, and therefore you have to pay lots of money into NATO. So it's a commercial thing. I suspect it's a bit of both, to be honest. Um, so we have this moment where you have this partnership for peace or path to peace type piece that NATO introduced to all the countries on the Baltic. Sorry, not Baltic, the Black Sea coast. So you've got like Romania, Georgia, Ukraine, and I don't know if Turkey was part of that at the time, but essentially what NATO was doing was starting to lay the foundations for those countries to become NATO members. This was NATO extending an olive branch, basically saying, we'll start helping you with your defense, or we'll start talking to you about your defense, and then we'll start advising you on X, Y, and Z. And then that just makes it easier for the integration between what was once, say, Ukraine and then the NATO partners, basically, because the command structures become similar, the training becomes similar, the weaponry becomes similar, all of these kind of good things. So this started to happen in 1997, at which point Russia got quite upset, as you'd imagine, because Ukraine is kind of in the belly of Russia. It's from the very top of Ukraine to Moscow is something like 500 kilometers or 800. It's really not that far, and Russia saw this as a big strategic threat at that point. At the same time as all this is on the go, you've then got the start of Russia's issues with Georgia, mainly because of this NATO project, essentially in the Black Sea, which led to, I think it was in 2008, if I remember rightly, Russia going into Georgia. Very short, sharp peace, and then that's then dealt with as they thought at that point. And then you've got continuing overtures from NATO towards Ukraine. And it really seems that around about somewhere between 2008 and 2012, the afterburners got turned on with Project Ukraine at that point, to the point where you go forward a little bit, and you have the maiden coup in 2014, and you then have the Russian response to the maiden coup. And for those of you that don't know what the maiden coup was, it was a period of time where essentially you had a Ukrainian officially elected government, which was overthrown by a popular uprising. There's a lot of debate whether who funded that popular uprising. There's a lot of potential CIA involvement. There was definitely NGO, non-governmental organization involvement. There was a lot of money being funneled into Ukraine. And it's not to say that Ukrainians didn't have agency, that they didn't want to be free from Russia's grasp. Um, but Russia, this is geopolitics 101, basically. You have a country that's right next to you, and they suddenly flip from being under your control or within your domain, and they flip to someone else's domain. That's a strategic problem for you as a country. You have to then sort that out in some way, shape, or form. So with this, I think the CIA, sorry, not the CIA. I think NGOs, American-led NGOs, I should say, were channeling billions into Ukraine, and I think it's something like it was like $5 billion or something like that. So in today's money, not a huge amount. Probably in those kind of days, not a huge amount too either. However, it wasn't just for for like food or for like things like that. It wasn't just like aid programs per se. Part of those NGOs, part of their mission was to change the political structures within those countries. Essentially, what they were doing was they were buying influence, and Western culture has a history of doing this to various different countries. You look at Syria recently. This happened in Syria massively. um, I think the Jeffrey Sachs. If you look at some of the Jeffrey Sachs stuff, look for Operation Timber Sycamore. That was the American-led overthrow of the Syrian government, and he's quite vocal about that at the moment, and rightly so, because this is what America does. It goes around making sure that there are problems in areas that are not in its backyard, basically, so that it can remain and keep its status as the world number one economy. China. So you can argue whether that's been successful or not, whether or actually America should have spent all of its energies on improving itself to retain its position as the number one economy and influence in the world, whilst not really focusing on China. So China kind of focused on itself and is now becoming the preeminent or economy and influence in the world. America's star is starting to fade, and we're seeing, and with the advent of Trump and JD Vance and all those kind of characters, we're starting to see it's over. A lot of people say that America is going to fall like the Roman Empire and stuff like that. We'll see. I certainly see that there's a lot of animosity towards China and other regions where there potentially could be threats developing. And when I say threats, I mean threats to their position within the world, basically. So is one of the reasons why America is going after Iran so much at the moment, and it's not just because of Israel, although it partly is, but it's because I think Iranian influence in that part of the world, if it managed to become much more influential than it currently is, so there was a period of time where it looked like Iran was going to take over Iraq. We go back to the Iran-Iraq wars. That looked like it was very possible. America flooded Iraq with weapons, with intelligence, with everything to hold Iran back. Primarily, they did that to stop, like the rebirth of a Persian stroke Iranian empire. That's essentially the region. I think if you had Iran and Iraq as two countries that were one country, caliphate, whatever you want to call it, that would be a massive economy. And they would have a huge amount of resource, and they would probably take over Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and places like that. I could go into the origins of the Iraq Kuwait war, but I won't because that's maybe for another program. It's really interesting, by the way. So I've kind of gone off on a little bit of a track about what America does and why it does it, basically. And they were doing the same in the Ukraine. So take this back on track. It's really interesting how all the machinations that made that occur. But ultimately, I think everyone understands, America's kind of playbook, as it were. It was even, I think there was a 2019 document by the Rand Corporation basically saying how they would execute regime change in various different, I think it was like 7 countries in 7 years. I think it was like something ridiculous like that. They talk about exactly how they would do it. And Ukraine was one of those countries. And then they've just played the playbook. I mean, anyone that believes that Ukraine fighting Russia wasn't instigated by the West, you need your head checked, to be brutally honest. This was ultimately a way of the West sticking it to Russia and making Russia bleed. That's the ultimate thing. It's about keeping Russia down. And I'm not saying that that Russia's a great they are a great country. Like China's a great country, like America's a great country. We're all great countries, but the geopolitics that surrounds us is quite sinister, in my opinion. So where we've got to is we've got to a place where America engineers a coup in Ukraine, and they absolutely did that. No, and I don't think anyone with a rational head on their shoulders believes otherwise. And this is in 2014. The Russians respond by essentially taking over Crimea, but pretending they're not. They send in the little green men, as I seem to remember at the time. They comprehensively defeated the Ukrainian army in the Donbass region. And then then you've got like the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreements, which were supposed to put an end to this type of conflict. what really happened was it just delayed the conflict by 8 years or so. We ended up in a position where, and I'm not saying Russians did break ceasefires or Ukrainians did break ceasefires. I'm sure both sides did. However, we've ended up in a situation where leaders from the time. So we've had the French leaders and Angela Merkel, the German leader, openly stating that Minsk One and Minsk Two were never going to be implemented, and that it was just to buy time to allow Ukrainian army to be rebuilt, way beyond the numbers that they had in 2014. So this was just a delaying tactic so that Ukrainians could then go on the offensive. And you have a point. I think it was in 2021 where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians go towards the contact line, which was in Donbass at the time, and you have a Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was essentially taken in. Oh, sorry, his ticket to get into the presidency in Ukraine partially was built on the foundations of he would implement the Minsk Two agreement, or the Minsk One agreement. I forget which the timings of both. However, that was part of his presidential ticket. Was I will make this work. I will implement these agreements, and we won't have a problem with Russia. Great, fantastic. The whole world kind of focuses on other things. He doesn't at all, and it increases tensions and all the rest of it. Russians get quite upset because clearly, they're not. They see that the agreement is not being implemented. The West has no intention of implementing the agreement, and so essentially by doing that, we're kind of poking the Russian bear quite a lot here. But we're saying it's their fault, So that's what's going on. And you'll see this in the propaganda that we see in our papers pretty much on a daily basis. It's always the Russians' fault. I'm not saying they're faultless. I'm just saying that's how it's always promoted. Interestingly, whenever Ukraine fail an attack, it's always the Ukrainians' fault for not listening to NATO offers. It's never NATO's fault for choosing the wrong plan of attack. But that's another point. We'll get to that another time. So we're in a position right now where we've got to about 2021, so we're nearly at the start of the war, so not too much longer to go, folks. We then get to a point where the Ukrainians really start antagonizing the Russians, who still have their little green men based in various parts of Ukraine, specifically in Crimea. But the Ukrainians start shelling Donbass basically, and they start and over a period of something like 8 years, they kill something like 14,000 civilians, which is a lot. You know, not so much as war, obviously, but in peacetime, that's quite antagonistic. The drivers for the actual conflict themselves seem to be that NATO felt that, or certainly Ukraine felt that its army, with its NATO training and NATO weaponry by this point, was in a good enough place to kind of reclaim the territory that had been lost in 2014. And so Ukraine start moving their many soldiers, and I'm talking tens of thousands of soldiers, towards the contact line. Essentially, the Russians see that and force match it basically. So they start moving their people. Then a couple of things happen. We're getting toward late 2021 by this point. So just before, so it was, was it February 23? Was it February 22 or late January 22? It's one of those 2 points. That's when the war actually started. But if you go to November 2021, a huge amount of diplomacy trying to be done between the Russians and the Americans. Where like the Russians want a treaty at that point to say, to formalize what had already taken place in 2014. And the one of the things that was happening at that point was that Ukraine was buying dual-use missile systems. Now, a dual-use missile system is a nuclear-capable missile system, so conventional rockets and nuclear-tipped rockets. Russians got wind of this and basically said, and by the way, these were going to be supplied by America. Um, at this point, the Russians kind of say to the Americans, let's not do that. That's not okay because we have a belligerent neighbor, and you're going to sell them a system that can potentially launch nuclear rockets at us. This is unacceptable. This is a step too far. We will have to do something about that. And the Americans then turn around to the Russians and say, do one. We'll sell whatever weapons we like to whoever we like. You cannot tell us who we can and can't sell weapons to. Fair enough. The Russians go, if that's the stance you want to take. Then you go forward into into January 2022. There's something called the Munich Security Conference, which happens every is it every year? Might be every year, but certainly that was happening in 2022. At this point, Vladimir Zelensky stands up at the Munich Security Conference and starts openly asking for nuclear weapons. Now, the two things taken together within 2 months of each other. So you've got Americans selling dual-use missile systems, and then you've got your neighboring country that you're kind of in a semi-war state with. There's a bit of gunfire every now and there's a bit of shelling every now and then, openly on the market for nuclear weapons. What are you going to do? Are you basically going to sit back, wait for them to acquire nuclear weapons and lob one over the border? Because that's essentially what was coming their way, and everyone knows that. At which point, that seems to be the trigger. That Munich Security Conference seems to be the trigger point for Putin to say, "That's it, we're going in." And then we've had what, 3 years worth of war since that point. And one of the really interesting things is that there was a New York Times article that just came out. So very recent. So we've had 3 years worth of war. I'm not going to go through the advances and defeats and all that kind of stuff by Russia and by Ukraine, because that seems to be relatively pointless at this stage. But I really want to give you a flavour of what's been happening from our side, and it's only coming out now. So 3 years down the line. So 3 years down the line, we've actually got articles within the New York Times talking about how much involvement NATO has had in executing essentially a proxy war in Ukraine. All of the orders, all of the battle plans, and everything like that, and all of the intelligence has been being done in Wiesbaden in Germany. So a NATO base in Wiesbaden. So the NATO officers are deciding what targets to select via their intel satellites, essentially American. Then they're handing over that targeting information to Ukrainians, basically, who have, the ATACMS missiles, the HIMARS missile systems, all these kind of things. And so they're not, and by the way, one of the semantics that's being used in this is like they call it points of interest rather than targets. So they can honestly stand up and say, yeah, we're not providing any targeting information. And technically, semantically, they're not, but they are providing location coordinates and calling them points of interest. So I'm sure you can make that connection yourself. It's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. So we've had a situation where we've had NATO officers essentially executing a proxy war in Ukraine from Wiesbaden in Germany, and that is just, we kind of knew this was on the case. It's not really talked about. I've kind of during my time, I've met some service people. I've met some service people on planes, for instance, basically, who couldn't talk about where they'd been. So that's British service people. So yeah. And when I asked them, oh, how long was it away? The flight times kind of matched Turkey, Ukraine, and where I was flying. Interesting stuff. Obviously, they were very tight-lipped. They didn't let anything away, but it didn't take a genius to work out where these guys had been. Anyways, moving on from that, we're now in a situation where we've got Trump and team trying to negotiate a settlement with both Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Mainly because I think we've got to a point where both the Russians and the Ukrainians are intractable now. They're up to their knees in blood with each other. Like both sides have committed some really bad and horrific acts. And I'm not going to say, well, it's war, that's okay. It's not okay. But these things happen in war. That's standard. You look back to your history in various other wars, and like some terrible things have happened in wars, and no one, any historian would tell you that. Me, I'm kind of like an amateur historian, an amateur political analyst. So you don't have to take my views at all. You can go and check everything out for yourself. But this is my take on what's going on. And this has been an interest of mine for some time. So I really wanted to start making videos on what seeing in the political landscape, and to talk about what I see as where it's going next. So we're in a position now where we have two sides that are not going to move. We've got very maximalist objectives from Russia regarding what they want to how they would envisage ending the war, which is demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification, or that's these are their words, by the way, denazification of Ukraine, recognition of the four regions that they've already taken as being now Russian, and then some various other bits and pieces. One of those other pieces is there can be no European force or something like that. There can be no European peacekeepers that go into Ukraine. And then we've got Ukraine that are basically saying, no, all right, we're a sovereign country. We get to choose the size of our army. You can't tell us that. If we want to be part of NATO, we'll be part of NATO. And they're actively trying to move in those two ways. So you've got these two objectives from the two sides, which are just completely at odds with each other, and it doesn't look like there's any compromise forthcoming. And in recent weeks, certainly within the last week, it seems like Trump's team is starting to get a bit pissed off now. They're starting to get to a point where they don't want to deal with this anymore. It seems like it's just too difficult, and it is difficult. It's complex, and it's rooted in lots of history and lots of bad blood and lots of moves by NATO and America, or the West ones, and counter moves by Russia, which has kind of fractured Ukraine into this really, it's just a political mess. It's a bit like what happened in Iraq. The country's an absolute mess, and we caused that. It wasn't a case of like, Saddam's a great leader or anything like that. He certainly wasn't. He was a terrible person. But the amount of deaths that happened subsequent to his toppling is off the charts. You check out the UN stats for how many civilians died once he was out of power. It's crazy. And look at the mess of the country that it turned into. With the rise of like Al Qaeda, the other various terrorist groups, I would say, that you would find within Iraq. And the same is probably the likely future for Ukraine, sadly. And I've met Ukrainians in my life, and they're wonderful people. I've met Russians, and they're wonderful people. I've met Americans, and they're wonderful people too. That the problem is that we've got a whole bunch of people sitting at the top deciding what direction they want to pull in, and in the middle of that, you've got Ukraine being torn apart, which is really sad because wonderful culture, wonderful people. So where does it go next? Sadly, I think what's going to happen is I think this. I think that Ukraine is going to end up getting rolled up by Russia. I have a very sneaking suspicion that Macron and Starmer are going to try and send troops in, potentially to Odessa. And it looks like the Americans are going to withdraw their support, both intelligence and actual weaponry as well. And that's just going to lead to just more problems and more conflict, basically. So yeah, I think we're in a position now where it's not looking great for Ukraine. It's looking like there's a lot of hardship to come, which is really sad. But ultimately, this could all end tomorrow if world leaders sat down and decided they wanted peace. It doesn't look like Starmer, Macron, Putin, Trump, Zelensky actually do want a lasting peace. It looks like they want to continue to try to achieve their objectives, and sadly, that means more people are going to die. So yeah, here endeth my first show. I hope you've kind of enjoyed that kind of scattergun approach to well, maybe not scattergun, maybe hopefully a bit more linear than that approach to what my view on what's happened in the Ukraine war is, and we'll start making these videos a bit more regularly, and hopefully I'll stop saying so much. You never know. Take care. Bye bye.